So, extreme medicine is hard to define and it's massive in scope. More than 20 years ago, in 2003, The Lancet explored the concept of extreme medicine in a special issue. And they observed that whereas previous supplements have brought together topics with a unifying theme, with extreme medicine the opposite is true. The essays they commissioned were very diverse and far from normal medical practice. 12 years later, Professor Chris Imray argued again in The Lancet that extreme expedition and wilderness medicine are modern and rapidly evolving specialties that address the spirit of adventure and exploration. It's basically about providing the best medical care in an outdoor setting, often involving ultra-endurance activities, especially in austere, remote and low-resource settings. So the context of austere or remote environments explain the association with desert, jungle, dive, mountain, polar and alpine medicine. Essentially, you're taking medical staff out of the hospital or the clinic, and therefore you can also learn lessons from military, humanitarian, disaster, and even space medicine. And I would argue that there are also lessons to be learned from sports and exercise medicine, and indeed, that extreme medicine is the new frontier of sports and exercise medicine. And here's why I'm saying this. According to the Fortune Business Insights, the global adventure tourism market is currently valued at more than $800 billion and is predicted to double by 2032. There are approximately 500 million participants in adventure sports, and that includes activities such as skydiving, adventure racing, scuba and free diving, kite surfing and mountaineering, which are also practiced in Qatar and by Qataris. And as you can see, Asia Pacific has the biggest part of the market. To put that in perspective, according to the same organization, the global sports tourism market, which consists of participants and spectators in sporting events, as well as visitors to sports venues, makes up only 3/4 of that in 2024, $620 billion. However, one of the biggest restraining factors on the growth of the industry is the concern about safety. Can you already see the opportunities here? Not only in terms of managing injuries and illnesses, but actually preventing them. But before we can talk about managing safety, we have to clarify what and who we're talking about. So extreme sports have been defined as sports, which means physical activity requiring specific skills, that expose participants to the risk of serious injury or death in the case of mismanaged execution. The adventure tourism industry divides these activities into soft and hard, depending on the type and the risk. For instance, many land-based activities like camping, hiking, and adventure racing are considered to be soft, and they make up about half of the market. Hard activities are usually considered to be more risky, and they often include water-based activities, so river rafting, scuba diving, and kite surfing. But they also include winter activities like skiing, snowboarding, ice climbing, mountaineering, and kite skiing. And then the rest is somewhere in between, which gives you an idea of how arbitrary these divisions can be. And this is further complicated by the fact that each activity actually has a range of risk. So for example, cycling is considered to be a soft activity and skiing a hard activity. But you can hardly compare a serious high-altitude downhill mountain bike with a family ride on the flats. And equally, skiing on a piste in a resort with ski patrol clinics and helicopters is not going to be the same as doing a first descent down a mountain in Antarctica. Nevertheless, according to these terms, the hard sector is about 25% of the market share, but it's growing very rapidly. The next question we need to ask is, who are we dealing with? And this answer is a bit easier. We're dealing with normal athletes in extreme environments or extreme athletes in any environment. And just like in traditional sports medicine, where we look after a wide range of people, from the overweight diabetic who's keen to start exercise, to the mammal, that's a middle-aged man in lycra, for those who don't know, to the weekend warrior, and then, of course, the Olympian. Extreme medicine also involves a range of people. So you have these unfit individuals in extreme environments. For example, this lady who is she's too weak to walk up to Everest Base Camp, so she's taking a horse. And this, if you can't walk at 4,000 meters, you're not going to walk at 5,000 meters. So she's going to be coming back in a helicopter, most likely. Then there are the weekend warriors on their dream trip to Antarctica. There are the elite ultra-endurance athletes, like Dr. Andrew Murray here. He's the physical activity champion for the Scottish government. He's trying to get more people active. He's won 14 international ultramarathons, and that includes running 7 ultras on 7 continents in 7 days. But for me, one of his most extreme accomplishments was running from the north of Scotland to the Sahara Desert. Can you imagine the temperature changes? And that meant he was averaging 62 kilometers a day for 78 consecutive days. And then there are the ones who many people consider to be completely crazy, like Dr. Glenn Singleman, yes, another medical doctor, this time from Australia. In 1992, Glenn taught Nick Fetteris, a base jumper, how to climb big walls. And Nick taught him how to base jump. And together they climbed and then jumped off the highest cliff in the world, the Great Rango Tower. At the age of 66, he's now engaged in more sedate sports, such as wingsuit flying with his wife, Dr. Heather Swan. And in case you think the previous generation was nuts and people today are more sensible, or that there are no firsts left in the world, here are 3 athletes who this year did the first ski descent of the same Great Rango Tower. So it's obvious that extreme medicine is about providing medical care for normal people in extreme environments and for extreme athletes in any environment. And then there's the why. One of the key things to consider when you're talking about safety and how to manage it is the motivation for taking risk in the first place. You might well wonder, are these people just addicted to danger? And therefore any normal risk assessment is not going to be valid for them. But according to the wingsuit pilot and physician Dr. Glenn, participants in these extreme activities are often not just pursuing danger. They're actually pursuing something much more rewarding. Transcendence. And this is the ultimate level in Maslow's triangle of human needs, above that of self-actualization. The fact is that these pioneers and their pursuit of the ultimate human experience inspire others. By the beginning of this year, more than 2,500 base numbers have already been awarded. Now you can apply for a base number once you've jumped off each of these 4 categories which makes up the acronym BASE. So buildings, antennas, spans, which are bridges, and earth, which are cliffs. And BASE competitions has actually been held since the early 80s, and it is still illegal in some countries, but it's becoming more and more popular, and it's now legal and encouraged in places like the mountains in the Norwegian fjords. But for others, it's the pure joy of participating in sporting environments in pristine natural, sporting activities in pristine natural environments, and this is true for me. For instance, the snow sport industries in America is the trade association of the winter outdoor industry in the US. And they conducted a nationwide poll in 2021. They found that there was a 5% drop in alpine skiing participation, but a 90% increase in ski touring participants across all age groups, genders, education levels, incomes, and ethnicities. And of course, very important to the industry, the sales of backcountry ski equipment rose by 115%. Now, the pandemic probably had a lot to do with this. But once you've bought the skis, and if you've experienced your first true powder snow on a volcano in Japan, there's no going back. And so now we know what we're dealing with, who we're dealing with, and why. So now we can ask, what exactly does sports medicine bring to this subspecialty? And if you read the literature or you look at the medical staff associated with expeditions, you'll see there's many different kinds of clinicians involved in extreme medicine. And certainly for the management of acute trauma or serious illness, emergency physicians and combat medics are very well suited. And then of course general practitioners are really good at managing the most common conditions you find on expeditions, such as gastrointestinal or respiratory illnesses. But sports medicine brings 3 major things. In sports medicine, it's as much about preventing injury and illness as it is about treating them. And when you have limited resources on expedition, preventing of injury and illness becomes more important than treating injuries and illness. Secondly, sports and exercise medics are very familiar with the concepts of traveling with a team. There are significant overlaps between traveling with an Olympic team to Paris and climbing team to Mount Everest. And for me, this is the most important one. It's about optimizing performance. So my twin sister recently had the opportunity to take over as an Everest expedition doctor after the original doctor had to be evacuated medically. And all the climbers had completed medical questionnaires before the trip. These were then checked by the doctor and further medical screening was organized if necessary. All of them had followed some sort of structured training plan, but none of them had a fitness coach, nutritional input, or a podiatry assessment. And this despite the fact that they were all in their 30s or 40s, burning more calories at altitude and on their feet all day in specialized climbing boots. This takes a while to, there we go. And contrary to what some people might believe, climbing Mount Everest is not a piece of cake. It requires a high level of cardiovascular fitness, essential climbing skills, perseverance, and the right mental attitude. This is the most popular route from base camp to the summit of Mount Everest, with a final camp on the South Col at 8,000 meters. 340 people have died on Mount Everest. It has the highest number of expeditions per year, but it's actually not the most dangerous mountain. It comes in at number 6. But on average, 1 out of every 6 expeditions will have a death. And sorry, these slides are taking a while. Just before the summit, just before summer day, climbers will ascend to the South Col from Camp 3, which is 800 meters lower. And if you look at the size of the climbers on this photo, it will give you an indication of the scale of the mountain. I don't know if you can see them, those little dots in the circle. And then once they're at the South Col, they sleep for a few hours. And then before midnight, they wake up to climb the summit and back. And this journey takes 12 to 18 hours of virtually non-stop climbing. And the climbing is all in the death zone, which is that part of the mountain above 8,000 meters, where life is basically unsustainable without supplementary oxygen. And the maximum acclimatization point before summer day is the Camp 3, which is at 7,200 meters. And this partly explains why most of the people who've died on Everest have died in this zone. But the Khumbu icefall is another major concern. The whole glacier moves down by 1 meter a day, which creates massive seracs and crevasses, which are very unstable. And is also exposed to avalanches off the west shoulder of Everest, all of which contributes to the fact that 12% of all deaths on Everest occur in the icefall. And the icefall is just above base camp, which means that it's crossed twice with every acclimatization climb. And if there are 5 acclimatization climbs, that means 10 times in an expedition, climbers have to go through the icefall, and this lasts several hours. And they mitigate this risk by going through the icefall at night whenever they can. Otherwise, the death toll would probably be a lot higher. And yet none of these climbers had any basic sports psychology inputs regarding self-talk, confidence, concentration, and managing fear. In other words, there was no performance optimization, despite the fact that this was for most of them a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And they would have paid somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 per person for this trip. So I think sports and exercise medicine have much to offer in this setting. So let's have a look at how sports medicine can embrace this change from traditional sports to extreme sports. Essentially, the same way you would approach travel to a major tournament with a team. There are pre-expedition, during expedition, and post-expedition phases, and each have several important areas to consider, which for most traveling team doctors or team medics will be very familiar. But there's one major difference, and that is the step before the pre-expedition phase. And this step should be accomplished even before you start thinking of the other steps, and that is, make sure you don't become a liability. Bar exceptional circumstances, not much can go wrong when you're traveling with a football team, to you. But if you're an expedition doctor, you can also suffer frostbite, altitude sickness, or contract exotic fever. So the most important rule is don't become a patient yourself. And this means education and training and upskilling yourself to not only survive but actually thrive in these extreme conditions. And this training should ideally start as soon as you've decided you want to be an extreme sports medic. You need to understand how to travel safely in these environments, how to cook food and prevent moisture from getting into your sleeping bag at minus 40 degrees Celsius. You need to know how to rescue somebody in the water, how to prevent yourself from getting decompression sickness when your scuba buddy makes an emergency ascent, and know what to do if you encounter the local fauna and flora. Or how to safely administer CPR on a steep slope, and most importantly, how not to get chopped up by the rescue helicopter. If you're interested in this kind of training, there are many courses available which are aimed specifically at medical staff doing these expeditions. And of course, you also need to know how to diagnose and treat injuries and illnesses associated with these environments. There's actually a handbook of extreme sports medicine which was published in 2017, and it covers many of these areas. But extreme sports medicine is still a very new subspecialty, so there's still a lot of research that has to be done. So, once you've skilled yourself and you're now ready to consider working with expeditions and extreme sports, now we can talk about how we tackle the expedition. And unfortunately, this talk doesn't give me enough time to cover all these steps. So I'm just going to focus on the most important one, which is the pre-expedition phase. And the most important step in the pre-expedition phase is the risk assessment. And the risk assessment for an expedition is the same as developing an injury and illness program for your team, such as this one, which was developed for male professional footballers, and it was published this year in the BMJ. It's based on a model which was proposed by Roald Bahr and Lars Engelbrechtsen in the IOC Handbook of Sports Medicine and Science already 15 years ago. Essentially, it's a 4-step plan which can also be applied to illness in your team. So what are the risks is the first question you have to ask. Do certain athletes have greater risk than others? Does the risk change throughout the season? And in our case, it's going to be the expedition. And should we do something about it? Or put more formally, risk identification, athlete risk factor analysis, season analysis, in our case, expedition analysis, and risk acceptance or mitigation. Now, a lot of people think that doing a risk assessment is a really boring job, but actually I love doing this because in your research you discover some amazing facts. But before we start, we just have to define the difference between a hazard and a risk. So a hazard is something that has the potential to cause harm, such as altitude, and a risk is the likelihood of that hazard causing harm and the severity of the harm, such as altitude sickness. So when we're doing a risk assessment for an expedition or adventure race, the different types of hazards correlate quite closely with the different steps in the process. I'm not going to be doing a season analysis. We'll do an expedition equivalent, which is travel-related and environmental changes throughout the different phases of the expedition or the race. And I'm not going to cover all of these because we don't have time. I'm just going to touch briefly on a few examples of these hazards. We'll start with activity or sports-related hazards and possible ways that you can mitigate for them. So as with any sport, it's really important that you need to know what sport you're dealing with, and you need to know what to expect in terms of injuries and illnesses. So at the extreme end of the scale, base jumping has been with us for 45 years. So there is actually some information in the literature about injuries and illnesses. But it's really hard to compare this with other sports because in other sports, injury frequency is expressed in terms of injuries per 1,000 hours of athlete exposure. But in base jumping, the exposure is literally seconds or minutes. So we have to go by injury risk per jump. And the studies suggest that the rate is 0.2 to 0.4% per jump, which is about 1 every 250 or 500 jumps. And not unsurprisingly, it's mostly concussions and knee and ankle injuries. The overall fatality rate is 0.04% per jump, which is about 1 in every 2,500 jumps. Now, these figures we've derived from epidemiology that's been published, but people don't have to record a fatality if it happens. So we can't say for sure if this is correct. But you can see, if you look at this graph, that there definitely is some trend, and that the fatalities are actually going up. And of course, there are more base jumpers now than in 1981 when they started this, and that could explain some of it. But there was something else that changed in 2002. And this is when tracking suits and wingsuits became more widely available. So just a few terms here. Flying slick means jumping without a suit. Tracking suits don't have wings, but they've got baffles. So as soon as there's an airflow over them, they will inflate, and the idea is to get you away from the wall as quickly as possible. Wingsuits, on the other hand, actually have wings, and they allow you to glide forward at a rate of 3 to 1. So for every 1 meter you fall, you can go forward 3 meters. So this is basically the closest human beings have ever been able to come to flying, which explains the attraction. But the demographic has also changed. So previously, base jumpers started with skydiving, and they would do hundreds of jumps before they would move on to base jumping without a suit. Then they would buy a suit, and they will go back to skydiving and learn how to fly the suit. And the added height when you're jumping out of a plane gives you a much bigger margin for error. And then once they felt confident in their skills, they would then go back and jump with the suits. But as you can imagine today, I don't want to say the younger generation, but I just said it. Many jumpers today want to skip all these steps. So they just go into base jumping, and then they buy a suit, and then they jump. And that might actually contribute to the statistics. And it's particularly proximity flying which is so dangerous. So this is where pilots skim trees and fly through rock holes like this guy. So how do you mitigate for this risk? I would say by patience, thorough training, and maybe a little bit of luck. And then on the other side of the scale, we have to think about other injuries like overuse injuries. And this also happens in extreme environments. So this is Leo Holding, Gene Bergen, and Mark Seddon. They set out to climb one of the most remote peaks in the world, Mount Spectre in Antarctica. And they planned to get there by kite skiing. So the expedition was a 1,650 kilometer 70-day journey across Antarctica, and they were pulling 200 kilograms pulk as a sled behind them. Now, if you look at kite surfing injuries, most injuries happen because of trauma, and there's an incidence of 7 to 17 per 1,000 hours of kiting, and that usually occurs either when people land from a jump awkwardly, or if they don't release their kite quick enough and they get dragged through obstacles. So these guys were not planning on any tricks, well, at least not deliberately. So their most likely injuries were going to come from getting dragged through obstacles or into crevasses, or perhaps overuse injuries. And what kind of overuse injuries can you expect with kiting? Well, unfortunately, there are virtually no studies of overuse injuries in kite surfing. There's even fewer in kite skiing, and I think there is absolutely none in kite skiing in one direction for several hours on consecutive days and weeks in freezing temperatures. So they had no idea what to expect. But they did believe that one potential overuse injury was going to be a freezing injury. So the stance which you require to resist the kite's pull can cause repetitive trauma and pressure on the toes, and this then compromises circulation and increases the risk of frostbite. And the apparent wind which is created by moving with a kite then further increases the risk of freezing injuries, particularly to the face. So goggles freeze, but then they realized if they removed the goggles, their tears would freeze in between blinks. So they had to put the goggles back again. And in the end, as a mitigation strategy, they basically wore their 8,000 meter down suits, ski boots three sizes too big with special insoles, and then a neoprene overboot. And they said that their feet were still cold, but at least they kept all their toes and fingers. And apart from all the usual aches and pains that you can expect from this kind of journey, there were no significant overuse injuries. Having said that, this is N equals 3, and these are some of the world's best endurance kite skiers. So I think we're going to see some more overuse injuries as the sport of kite skiing becomes more popular. So next up are expedition-related hazards. And this includes many different possible risks, such as issues with finances, communication, languages, leadership, medical kits and equipment, and medico-legal issues. But there's one potential expedition-related risk for which you have to plan, and this actually closely relates to your mitigation strategies. It doesn't matter what the level of risk is that you've accepted in an expedition, you always need an evacuation plan. And the type of expedition you're covering will determine what this plan will look like, and that plan needs to be set in place long before the expedition starts. And it needs to be detailed, has to be communicated to the entire team, and there needs to be easy access to information. So depending on the terrain, the initial response in the search and rescue can be quite a challenge, as you imagine, and it will be different. It depends on whether you're in the Namibian desert, whether you're injured at Camp 4 on Everest, whether you're in the Costa Rica jungle or on a boat in rough seas. And you need to consider who's doing what your response will be, where the local closest medical facilities will be, all the contact details for these people, a clear communication plan and a backup plan. And then you also need to know how to repatriate a body and what you're going to say to the media when they find out, which inevitably they will. But some destinations are on a completely different scale when it comes to evacuation plans. So this Spectre expedition involved many hours of difficult technical climbing. Unfortunately, they didn't have any incidents in climbing, but one of their polks did get pulled into a crevasse, and they had to fish the polk out. Fortunately, none of the skiers got injured. But before they set off, they had to pay $100,000 bond to make sure a plane will come to fetch them if there's an injury. That plane would then have to refuel, and this all would depend on good weather. So as it happened, they experienced 70-kilometer-hour winds in temperatures of less than minus 70 degrees Celsius, and this lasted several days. So basically, they had to accept that for some injuries, there would be absolutely no evacuation. And that's something which had to be discussed and agreed and accepted by everybody. Now, I've given you an example here, an extreme example of just 3 climbers, and they didn't have a doctor, so their plans were organized by themselves. But if you're doing this kind of thing, there are more and more Antarctica expeditions going, and most of them now have doctors associated with them. And of course, the environment will stay exactly the same. Okay, and then sometimes it's not the conditions per se, but it's actually the emergency planning which is a problem. So I don't know if you recall the Gansu ultramarathon disaster in May 2021. This was an ultramarathon in China where 21 elite ultramarathon athletes died during the race. And it was hit by a storm with gale force winds and hail, which wasn't the problem. The problem was that the mitigation strategies were inadequate. So there were a lot of errors in the risk assessment, the strategies, the medical evacuation plan. And then tragically, there was another death when one of the organizers committed suicide 2 weeks after the race as a result of the media fallout. So evacuation plans are really important. I'm going to skip individual hazards because they are very similar to what we see in traditional sports medicine, and you can do a completely different talk about this. But environmental hazards are very common in extreme medicine, and it's the cause of some very interesting medical conditions. So there's the obvious hazards leading to risks such as heat exhaustion and desert races, and altitude sickness, avalanches or hypothermia in mountain expeditions. But there are also more unexpected risks, such as frostbite in appendices other than fingers and toes. So this is Dr. Alex Brazier. He's an Antarctic explorer and another doctor who developed polar penis in 2016 when he skied across Antarctica. But this problem is not just unique to polar regions. Remi Lindholm is a Finnish cross-country skier who developed the same problem during the Beijing Olympics. His 50-kilometer race was reduced to 30 kilometers and the start delayed because of bad weather conditions. But they still competed in air temperatures of minus 18 degrees Celsius and very thin cross-country ski clothing. And then there's a closely related but slightly different condition which is called polar thigh. It seems exclusive to Antarctica, which is much windier and drier than the Arctic. And cold is a factor in some cases, but there may also be some microstructural damage to the skin, possibly caused by clothing flapping in the wind. And this causes abrasions in the skin. And there are others who blame wool underwear and bacterial contamination. It usually happens in the front of the thigh, but there are other places that can be affected too. And it starts looking like a non-freezing injury, but then it develops these big ulcerations, and the only way to treat it is with skin grafts. Preet Chandy is a physiotherapist and a British Army medical officer. So she did a solo ski expedition in Antarctica in 2022, and she developed polar thigh while skiing. And after the expedition, it was treated with a skin graft, and in June this year, her case was written up as the first ever scientific account of an adventurer with polar thigh. So, how would you mitigate against this risk? Well, Dr. Alex Brazier fixed his problem by stuffing a woolly hat down his trousers, which apparently stayed there for the next 80 days. Another approach would be to wear down pants, as you can see in the top picture, or a down skirt, and to try and minimize any flapping of clothing or anything which can cause abrasion of the skin. And then, of course, if you're at extreme cold environments, you have to cover all skin. Any skin that's exposed could be prone to frostbite. So the next hazard group to consider is travel-related hazards. Now, you might think, as a medic, there's very little you can do about travel risks. But I want to walk you through the risk assessment for this particular one to demonstrate the process and to show you where you may play a role. So for each hazard, we need to calculate the risk magnitude. And there are many models of risk assessment, but this 5x5 grid is commonly used in medicine, also by Barr and colleagues. And where possible, this should be driven by data. For example, in Barr's model, the likelihood is expressed in the number of injuries per 100,000 hours of exposure, and the severity as the number of days lost from training or competition. And this is the data is derived from epidemiological data. But the problem is, in extreme sports medicine, there's very little good data available, partly because it's so difficult to do good quality research in these extreme environments, and partly because there are so few people doing it. So the risk assessment is often based on individual perception, and therefore it's biased. But until more data is available, we have to deal with this. And then it's complicated by the fact that in the extreme medicine literature, likelihood is often expressed as improbable, remote, occasional, probable, and frequent. And this occurs basically once a century, once a decade, once a year, a month, or a week. Whichever grid you use, it should be pretty obvious that you need to do your research, and especially if you don't know the sport you're dealing with or the country you're traveling to. So let's say we're going to go on an Everest expedition in Nepal. And you could say that travel is an essential part of most expeditions, and it's nowadays is relatively safe, so we can just skip that one. But that's not true for Nepal. In fact, fatal accidents in the world in aircrafts have reduced by more than 90%. But in Nepal, the trend doesn't look the same. In fact, it's so bad that all Nepali airlines have been banned from the European airspace for the last 12 years. And these are the casualties from aircraft accidents in Nepal since 1955. This is the latest one, a helicopter crash killing the pilot and all 4 tourists on board only 4 months ago. In total, almost 1,000 people have lost their lives due to air crashes in this country over the past 70 years. But what's truly astonishing is the number of accidents. There's been 100 accidents over that period of time, and several years you see several accidents. So in 1992, when 280 people died, there were actually 4 different accidents, 2 involving international and 2 domestic aircraft. 1999 was a terrible year with 7 accidents, closely followed by 2006 with 6 and 2016 with 5. 12 of these happened on the route up to Everest, and 10 of them was in the last 33 years. Another 43 happened at the airport, where all the expeditions depart from. So in fact, more than 50% of the accidents are on the route from Kathmandu to Everest Base Camp. And 42 of them were in the last 33 years. So if we plot aircraft-related risks for an expedition to Everest on our assessment grid, then you would say that there were 42 accidents on our route in the last 33 years, which best fits with 1 a year. So that's occasional. And the severity is probably likely to be major or extreme. It's an aircraft accident, of course. So this makes it a high or extreme risk. So now we've determined the magnitude of the risk. Now we have to decide, what are we going to do about this? Are we prepared to accept this risk or not? If we accept it, we need to decide, is it possible to mitigate it? And of course, this decision is up to the expedition and each individual member of the expedition. So you need to have this discussion long in advance. And it also depends on their risk tolerance level. So for air travel in Nepal, can we avoid this risk? Of course we can. We cannot go, or we could walk, which will add weeks to the expedition, or we could travel by road, which has its own unique set of risks. Can we avoid the worst airlines? Well, good luck with choosing. These are the ones who've crashed. And usually if you have to choose from a number of dodgy airlines, the best bet is to go with a national carrier, which in this case is indicated in red, the Royal Nepali Airlines. I have to say I'm not convinced. And probably they do carry the most number of people, so that might explain why they have so many accidents compared to the others. But they definitely don't have a great reputation, although it does seem to be getting a little bit better in the last few years. And in my case, I would definitely want to avoid fishtail helicopters, which, by the way, was the helicopter I showed you in the beginning. So we can't really avoid it. So now you could say, okay, this mitigation is out of our hands. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's just move on to the next risk, right? Well, maybe not. So if you go back to the research on aircraft accidents in Nepal, we see that 40% of these accidents didn't result in any fatalities. So this means that probably there would have been people injured in those accidents. They may not have died, but they were injured. By the way, I have to say this information is not easily available. I have to thank my sister Liesel, who searched for this information and managed to create these graphs. So basically the message that comes through is, as a medic, if you're going on an Everest expedition, you may achieve quite a lot if you update yourself on trauma triage protocols and you pack basic life and limb-saving equipment in your hand and carry-on luggage, and you make sure your team members know how to use it too. Because there is a good chance that you'll have injuries and fatalities, but injuries on the trip. So, we don't have time in this talk to discuss all the rest of it, but I just want to take the last section of this talk to briefly touch on what sports medicine can offer in terms of performance enhancement in extreme athletes. And I want to use here the example of adventure racing. Of course, we have many famous and extreme races in the world, like these ones, but we also have a tough adventure race right here in Qatar. And I must say I was very pleased to hear that two of our leadership team, Dr. Jamal and Dr. Abdulaziz, will be participating in this race, which kicks off in 2 days' time. So the Samla race poses quite a challenge. It starts with a 3-kilometer open water swim. Then it's followed by a 66-kilometer off-road run. There's a 6-kilometer paddle in the sea, a 75-kilometer off-road mountain bike ride, a shooting session, and finally another 50-kilometer run. So there are 250 participants who have to cover this distance of 200 kilometers in 50 hours maximum. The water temperature will average about 25 degrees Celsius, but it might be colder depending on the conditions. And the air temperature can reach up to 40 degrees in the day and much colder at night. Most importantly, there's a big pot of prize money for the people for the first 10 competitors who finish, and also a huge amount of prestige, not only for those who win, but for those who finish the race. So this means that there's a massive incentive to complete this race, even against all odds. And competitors in this race needs endurance, cycling fitness, special skills and techniques, strength, and above all, mental fortitude and resilience. They need to manage their food and water intake. They need to deal with injuries and environmental issues, such as dust, heat, and cold, even cold in Qatar. They have to decide if and when and how long they're going to sleep. And they also have to deal with this mental challenge of being on their feet for up to 50 hours. So what can we as sports medics offer these athletes? Firstly, sports physicians can help them by offering a tailored screening test, looking for example at general health, pre-existing injuries and illnesses, blood tests to identify vitamin and mineral deficiencies, cardiology and fitness testing, which form the basis of a good training program. So if you can pick up issues such as mineral and vitamin deficiencies early on in the training program, this can really contribute to performance later. And also if you can identify overtraining issues or training errors before they become major problems, this might actually help them to get to the starting line rather than having to pull out. Sports scientists can advise them on training plans. They can check their biomechanics and provide advice on footwear. Even small biomechanical or gait abnormalities can become really big problems once this kind of endurance training starts. And then nutrition and hydration are really important issues. I would argue one of the most important performance enhancement methods in endurance events. So adventure racers don't just have to increase their calorie intake, they have to change what they eat. And it has to be tailored to individual people. So nutritionists can really play an important role in helping people to organize this. And then we also have things like hydration. So in a race like this, overhydration might be as important as underhydration. And you can't use thirst as a reliable indicator of your hydration status. So you need to have a plan. You need to know how much fluid you're losing and how much fluid you need. Then we also have, here in Qatar, we have world experts in environmental issues such as heat. And they can actually give excellent advice on how to acclimatize to the heat. And I think this is going to be especially important in the next year when the Samla race is open to participants from all different nationalities, different countries and different sexes. So people are not used to racing or living in the desert. And then finally, sports psychologists can provide useful advice and tools for athletes to prepare for this mental resilience they're going to need, especially towards the end of the race. When they're exhausted, they're on their own in the dark, and most of the spectators have gone to bed. That's when they're going to need that mental resilience. And for those who do suffer acute or overuse injuries during training or during the race, sports physicians and physiotherapists with a knowledge of sports-specific issues can provide advice and treatment, which might actually help them get to the finishing line rather than just telling them to stop, and can also help them with recurrences, prevention of recurrences in the future. And as we've already discussed in the bigger picture, sports medics can assist with medical risk assessment and mitigation plans, first aid and training, and medical kits for athletes and their support crew. And of course, the NSMP medics, together with the HMC ambulance services, will provide medical cover at this race, as they've been doing for many years already. I'm not aware of any other sports medicine or other medical center in the world where extreme athletes can access experts in injury and illness prevention, team and expedition travel, and especially performance enhancement, all under one roof. Aspetar's vision is to be a global reference center in sports medicine. I would suggest that we now have an opportunity to be the world's first global reference center in extreme sports medicine. I hope I've convinced you that extreme sports medicine is the next frontier in sports medicine, and that offers not only the opportunity to work in beautiful and pristine places, but also the opportunity to bring high-quality sports medicine into challenging environments, and to work with some truly exceptional people. And if you enjoyed the content of this talk, then you might want to read the Aspetar Journal, which will be released this week. It's already available online, and it actually features some of the rock stars of extreme sports medicine. And I'd like to thank my twin sister Liesel, who really significantly contributed to this talk. Thank you.